Okay, I think we can get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. Welcome to our webinar, Restoring Aquatic Ecosystems, Where Do Research, Policy, and Practice Meet? This webinar is co-hosted or co-organized by Canadian Science Publishing, CSP, and the Society of Canadian Aquatic Sciences, SCAS. My name is Christine Madliger. I am an assistant professor at Algoma University in Northern Ontario, and I am the SCAS chair of the webinar committee. I'd also like to introduce Neil Fisher, who is team leader integrated planning at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Neil is also a member of the webinar committee. He's co-organized this session, and he'll be serving as a co-moderator with me. We also want to acknowledge Natalie Sapinka and Albana Burberry, who are journal development specialists and are co-organizers from CSP. I want to let everyone know that the webinar is being recorded. It'll be available on the SCAS YouTube channel following the event. You can also view all of our previous webinars there, including a number that were co-organized by CSP and SCAS if you have interest. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that we're all coming together virtually today, but we're spread across Canada and maybe even into other regions of the world as well. But we'd like to recognize the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today and ask that everyone consider the territory in which they're situated and their own personal responsibility and processes of reconciliation. We can also encourage you to consider how our professional societies, our publishers, and the other organizations that we're a part of can play a role in reconciliation and bridging awareness with action. So I am going to pass it over to my co-moderator, Neil, who's going to give you a little bit more information about how we're going to proceed through the webinar today.
Thank you, Christine. I'm really excited about the turnout today for the talk about aquatic ecosystem restoration. Today's webinar brings together four individuals with expertise and many experiences in the ecological restoration research and practice space. We're very happy to have Karen Smokorowski, Sarah Matchett, Catherine Febria, and Nick Lapointe joining us today. Our panelists span different sectors and career stages, and it's a privilege to have them here today. As a general outline of the structure of the webinar, we'll start by asking the panelists to introduce themselves. Then we'll follow by asking them a series of prepared questions, aiming for about 10 minutes for audience questions at the end. So to the panelists, please briefly introduce yourselves and tell us how your work fits into aquatic ecosystem restoration space. Starting with Nick Lapointe.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, so Nick Lapointe. I'm joining from Ottawa in the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I lead the Canadian Wildlife Federation's freshwater program, which is largely focused on habitat policy and freshwater connectivity. My background's in fisheries science, and currently I sort of do a mix of research as an adjunct professor, work on policy and then implementation of conservation projects. And a big area around restoration that we focus on is on conservation planning and prioritization, implementation of those projects, and the policies that relate to restoration, including restoration funding and offsetting mechanisms.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. Catherine?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be part of this webinar. I'm an ecosystem ecologist by training, and I'm really grateful to be an immigrant settler scientist here to Turtle Island, originally from the Philippines. I'm trained in all things freshwater ecology, the connections between molecules and ecosystems, but I currently hold an associate professor position at the University of Windsor, as well as a Canada Research Chair in freshwater restoration ecology. I'm really grateful to direct the Healthy Headwaters Lab, which sits in Windsor or Waiwiatanong ZB in the Great Lakes Basin. And this is an initiative and an effort to do intentional place-based relationship building, capacity strengthening, and sharing, knowledge co-production, all in service to freshwater restoration. So I sit here obviously as me, but I represent more than 25 people in our team who are degree and land-based learners, Indigenous youth, and technical staff who really collaborate intentionally through a kinship-based approach to freshwater restoration. Yep, just happy to listen and learn and yeah, be here in community with you all. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you, Catherine, for being with us here today. Over to you, Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Smokorowski. I am a research scientist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. I've been working here in Sault Ste. Marie for 28 years with Fisheries and Oceans on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. Respectfully acknowledge that. My career focus has largely been, well, almost exclusively been in support of the Fisheries Act and the implementation of the Fisheries Act by Fisheries and Oceans Canada habitat managers, now called the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program. Largely, my empirical research has focused on impacts-based research to try to help understand how to balance those impacts. But a lot of it, I have recognized that through the various iterations of the Fisheries Act, there's always been a requirement to either compensate or offset for the developments that occur that can't be mitigated or avoided and that impact fish and fish habitat. And so the monitoring that is required for those compensation, or now called offsetting projects, has been a big focus of my career in trying to improve how we can learn from these habitat experiments that we allow to happen, hundreds of them annually. So restoration per se has not been part of my empirical research. How to improve monitoring of restorations, whether you call them offsets or compensation, has been a big focus of my career. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's great to have you as a research scientist with the department and supporting our program, Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program. And next over to Sarah Matchett, who also works on the integrated planning team at the Canadian Centre for Inland Waters. Sarah, introduce yourself.
Thanks, Neil. Hi, everybody. I'm joining you from Burlington, Ontario today, which is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis people. It's covered by the Dish with One Spoon Agreement. This land is also part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas, the Credit. Also just wanted to acknowledge the Nayano Nibimang Gichigamine, or the Great Lakes region. This is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands and waters of numerous Indigenous nations. And I just wanted to make sure we acknowledge that. I'm a biologist here with Fisheries and Oceans Canada at FFHPP, the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program, as Karen spelled out for us. So this group is responsible for making decisions about impacts to fish habitat. I've worked and volunteered in the restoration space for a bunch of years now, both as a regulator with the department and then as a volunteer. So at DFO, we review projects near water and work with proponents to try and avoid and mitigate those impacts, as Karen described. Where those impacts cannot be avoided, we work with proponents and others interested in fish habitat to offset the impacts by protecting and restoring functions in the aquatic ecosystem. Back to you, Neil.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. And so we have the panel of four to start answering the series of prepared questions, and then we'll have 10 minutes after to have questions come in from those of you that are joining us here today. So to begin, I'd like to ask all the panelists to think about and share a successful ecological restoration project that you were involved with or have evaluated. What made it successful, and were there any surprising aspects of the project that may have contributed to its success, or a challenge that you adapted to make it successful? So let's start with Karen, Dr. Karen Smokorowski.
Mute button. So throughout my career, I haven't actually been directly involved in any on-the-ground restoration project. A lot of offset projects have occurred, and I have worked to try to do some better monitoring of those through empirical research. But well, the one big project I had in that regard, COVID derailed, as did a flood year. So it wasn't successful. But I am a longstanding member of something called the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation. That's part of a global network to try to improve how evidence from the literature is used to answer some important questions. And so the Canadian chapter is out of Carleton University. It's led by Dr. Steve Cook. And so I've been part of that group for a long time. And what it does is it it produces what's called systematic literature reviews, which are reviews that are done in a way that is designed to eliminate bias as much as possible in terms of the evidence that's gathered and collected and analyzed to answer these important questions. So the one that I thought I would highlight today was titled "The Effectiveness of Spawning Habitat Creation or Enhancement for Substrate Spawning Temperate Fish." And so that one, I was part of leading a number of systematic reviews that are real important to Fisheries and Oceans Canada. But this one, we really decided to focus on substrate spawning fishes because those are the types of offsets that are most often conducted. So you're going to mess up fish habitat over here. Let's just throw in a spawning shoal over here, and all is said and done and good. But we don't really know how effective they are. So this systematic review used very rigorous approach to gather the evidence and conduct a meta-analysis. And overall, we did conclude that that the substrates for hard substrates and gravels and cobbles did actually improve spawning fish abundance outputs relative to the controls. But there were, so we would say they were successful, as did vegetation additions and some other substrate habitat alterations. So this was good news. What we've been doing, what we think help, actually does help. But some of the things that also came out of the systematic review, which unfortunately was common to a lot of our reviews, were that a lot of the evidence base was excluded from the rigorous process because of the high probability of bias in terms of the design, the lack of appropriate controls or replication, and lack of rigorous design and planning in the study. So they had to be thrown out. What we did also conclude, though, was that the higher quality studies seem to also result in a higher outcome for fish. We weren't sure of the reason for that. It could partly be just because the higher quality studies, in terms of the design, also perhaps had a better overall budget for doing the restoration to begin with, so it was built better to begin with. We weren't able to conclude that. Because such a large part of the evidence base was thrown out, we also did a parallel technical report where we included these lower quality studies. And thankfully, they still did conclude that adding substrate for fishes did result in a benefit, but not as strong of a benefit. But unfortunately, we also realized that there are probably thousands of studies that weren't included in this review because the results were just unavailable, or the data were unavailable to be included, just unpublished, or in reports gathering dust on somebody's shelf. And so really the importance that came out of this is that we need to improve how we monitor. We need to improve the collection of the data, the reporting of the data, and the design of the studies, and the availability of these results for broader analysis so that we can improve our learning. But overall, it does look like throwing in substrates everywhere does, well, not everywhere, in places designed to improve spawning for fish that require substrate for spawning is a benefit. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Yeah, that was a very interesting study, and I'm looking forward to applying what we've learned from that research science advice that was provided by the Canadian Science Advice Secretariat. So thank you very much for that, Karen. I think if we'll move on to the next panelist to answer that question about successful restoration, and move over to Nick Lapointe.
Yeah, so I have a small example project of a Forest Service Road culvert in BC that was blocking salmon migrations. And one of my teammates, Betty Rebellato, led this project in collaboration with local partners, especially provincial staff. This was, one of many stream crossing barriers in the Horsefly River watershed, which is a sub-watershed of the Fraser River, that we'd identified through our watershed scale prioritization process. That we had done, in partnership with local stakeholders and Indigenous partners. For this and other structures, one of the approaches that we used was we followed the province's Fish Passage Technical Working Group's process for addressing barriers, which is to first assess the barrier in the field or the structure in the field to see if it is impassable. If it is, then we would do a second step they call a habitat confirmation, where we're confirming that the upstream habitat would be suitable for the target species, and that there's no other unmapped barriers. That could be a natural waterfall or another unmapped structure, sort of downstream of that structure or close by upstream that would compromise the benefits of removing that. And then, once that all checks out, we would commission formal designs for a replacement structure and proceed with permitting and construction. We received funding from the Pacific Salmon Commission, which is about $250,000 to replace this with an open bottom structure, a bridge. But as part of that, Betty, working with the provincial staff, realized that the road segment that this crossing was on was redundant with other roads that existed that would allow access to the various parts, cut blocks of that region. And so they were able to decommission that segment of the road. And so this had better ecological benefits. We were able to completely remove the crossing and restore in-stream habitat, rewild the roadbed itself, and it was a lot less expensive. I think it was about $90,000. So pretty small, simple project, but a good example of some win-wins that came out of it.
Excellent example, Nick. Success with less. I think many would like to hear more about those positive examples. Thank you very, very much. All right, over to Dr. Febria.
Great, thank you. I love hearing about these success stories. I think we need to be sharing them more and more. I think to answer this question, I was thinking a lot about what success is to like, how do we define that, and what are those dimensions of success, and who determines it? And I think for this answer, I'll be really thinking about, and I think I always think about intergenerational justice, and as the work that we're doing here to benefit us currently or future generations of people, but also our plant and animal relationships that we need, and how can those efforts that we do now be self-sustaining? So those are the kinds of things that I really try to hang my hat on, and it's really difficult in a sort of funding and institutional framework where a lot of things are short, sort of short windows of time and individual projects. So I think just the broader way that I come to thinking about success is really looking at a number of different lines of evidence. One is the evidence in the published literature that shows that, after decades, we see very similar patterns about despite having really good intentions, the outcomes of recovery are really slow, or just not necessarily returning the levels of desired species or kind of services like swimmable, drinkable, fishable water to levels that we would like. So, I always ask questions around what are the building blocks of those elements, and if it's our freshwater food webs, who are they living with? What do they depend on? And what are the things that we could measure and feel and sense about wellness that we can embed into our projects? So there is empirical evidence that we can do to monitor and coordinate monitoring. And there's also a lot of what I think is the restoration of relationships that are required if we really want to see successful outcomes. And there's that tension because there's a lot of global calls to do more, but the global solution is truly local. So I have a couple of examples that locally in the Great Lakes that I feel really are the stories of my students to share around mitigation translocation of unionid freshwater mussels, of collaborating on biomonitoring data to show matches and mismatches of stewardship within the watershed. But I think what I want to tell you about is an example in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's a place where I lived and worked for a decade in collaboration with our freshwater group at the University of Canterbury. We formed an experiment called the Canterbury Waterway Rehabilitation Experiment. And the context for this work in Aotearoa is very similar to Canada. It involved, a research group, but more than 40 landowners, private foundation who was funding this work, nearly 10 kilometers of farmed waterways and agricultural landscapes, a landscape and tapestry of mana whenua, or traditional indigenous Maori, who really had spiritual values placed on the wetlands that we were hoping to help restore. And the trialing of multiple projects and students, more than a dozen of students and postdoctoral researchers trialing different combinations of tools and investing in a process of co-production. So I'll put the case study in the chat today, but what I think emerged from that is this idea that investing in processes and relationships to guide science is being really important if we want actionable outcomes and lasting impacts. And most critically, it's like when the researcher or when that funding stream steps out, are the relationships to steward and heal land and water there and remains? It really crystallized this approach of a kinship worldview that we really are all in this together, whether we're in a city or a farm field or in a watershed or the Great Lakes Basin, where you get all of that. Partnerships really do generate co-benefits that move beyond number of trees planted, number of kilometers restored, and really help. Now that I've stepped away and come back to Turtle Island, this idea that those relationships in those watersheds really can help be nurtured and sustained. And some of the surprising outcomes were, we had 4 kilometers in one watershed, a number of hectares of a wetland in a privately owned farm, all stewarded as part of these experiments. And a local school took up the responsibility in the same watershed to crowd fundraise trees to be planted in a section of the watershed that we couldn't get to. This sort of approach is what we want to see more of, but it's so local and we think it doesn't matter. But when we start looking for local and stitching together sort of this general, what is the convergence? It is this idea that when we all do this work together, the global solution is now then really real and something that we can all, root in and fight for and contribute to. So I'll put those case studies in the chat. But what was also really clear is that the farmers and the community members told us they weren't reading our papers. So we invested in more than 47 newsletters and social media posts. I joined Twitter in the 2010s because that's where farmers were telling us they were going to read our science. And it turned out that the sort of things we were measuring, like impact, really did sort of go orders of magnitude when we met people where they were at in terms of on farm fields, in social media, or in community. And for me, I'll always carry that story that it is possible, even 10 years later, looking back, that those relationships are still there. And I'm so grateful that when I do get to go back, the friendship and the relationships and that commitment still remains for a number of us who participated in that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and for sharing those the perspectives and the knowledge and the experiences that you've had. Seeing hearts in the chat, and I think many that are listening here today are probably thinking of examples where they've had this happen, and it's relating to what you've just said. So really appreciate your discussion here today. So I'm going to move it over to now Sarah Matchett with DFO to share some program and regulatory program perspective.
Thanks, Neil. I actually don't have a program example to answer this question. I'm thinking about a restoration project that's actually still in the works. So while I can't call it a successful install yet, it's been successful to date. So this is it's a collaboration that's very positive in my mind. It's a minor creek alteration to reduce erosion on one of the downstream banks. And so some small fixes like toe protection, wind deflectors, and rock weirs. This is a project that I'm working on as a volunteer with Freshwater Conservation Canada. My local chapter in this area is the Ted Knott chapter. So one of my mentors in this business has walked this one water course. It's a tributary in the Bronte Creek watershed, and we've walked this stream for many spring seasons, pointing out small changes, small fixes we can do here or there. But we were recently able to secure funding through the Greenbelt Foundation. And so we were also able to collaborate with a former colleague of ours who now has an environmental construction business and is donating some time in kind. So the project has been surprising so far, just given the pre-restored state. It's formerly a cold water community, but last summer we did some pre-construction sampling and we found northern pike, rainbow trout, Johnny rainbow, fantail darters, and black-nosed dace. So I guess this restoration project, I'm hoping will be successful. It's been successful so far because of just the collaboration and community that we've built. The other part of this project that is maybe thinking a little bit longer term and thinking about more of the watershed as a whole. The project is just upstream of a community that we've been working with probably over the last 6-7 years, trying to educate them about some of the functions that exist in this ecosystem, and maybe some of the functions that are impaired due to like some practices. So we're working with them to start, instead of just talking about things, actually making changes on their own properties. So trying to get that stewardship component involved as well. This is some of this stuff that Dr. Febria was just mentioning in her example. So we're really trying to take that exact same approach of global solutions, but starting in your own backyard, literally in the backyard of our collaborators here. So I think I'll send it back to you, Neil, or maybe to Natalie for the next segment. Thanks.
Maybe just say thank you, Sarah. And although not directly regulatory related, DFO does get involved with these at a time when permits are required. So we do see these things, and appreciate you sharing your knowledge with these groups on your volunteering in your other life as a biologist. So there's one question in the chat. If we can, Christine, if we go to that quickly here, and it's from Morgan Edwards. I'm asking if they're curious about signals of climate change impacts on restoration effectiveness or approaches that panelists have seen. I'm thinking maybe Karen, because they're asking about with respect to the meta-analysis of spawning substrate restoration now 7 years ago.
Yeah, we didn't specifically consider climate change. I mean, we were just analyzing the results that were provided. The only thing that I can think to answer this question is that when we are talking about monitoring, when we're talking about restoration, and not only the need to design and build, but the fact that you need to design and build it with natural processes in mind, and understanding that some of these more extreme events can happen much more frequently than they used to in the past. So maybe 1 in 100-year flood is no longer 1 in 100 years. And when it comes to monitoring, I know that something I'll be describing a little bit more detail coming up, that the monitoring trigger can be, and the timeline can be reset after an extreme event occurs, to ensure that still working despite that extreme event. So otherwise, yeah, the review was just of the literature as it existed, and that wasn't part of our question.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. And I think that's, you've just expanded on another element to all this is the monitoring and adapting our planning processes to ensure that we're considering the potential future environment that we're working in. So I'm going to turn it over to Christine now, maybe to move to the next question, because I recognize, cognizant of the time here, and I could listen to you guys all day and keep chatting, but we would like to get to maybe the other questions. So Christine?
Sounds good. So one thing, that's constant about the government space is that it can feel like it is ever changing. What do you think is needed to help navigate restoration during periods of governmental change, like we might be experiencing right now? So for these questions, we've kind of tailored them to a couple panelists for each one, and then we'll get back to, polling everybody at the end. So for this one, I was hoping Sarah could answer first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Christine. I think this question probably could have come to anybody on this panel. Everyone, and probably a lot of us in the audience as well, have been through the type of change that you're referring to in the question. This often means less access to funding for aquatic restoration. And I see William Parker in the chat has brought that up, and I'll try to address that question as well. The answer that I did think about this ahead of time, what do we need to navigate restoration during periods of government change? I think it's absolutely invaluable to make connections and establish relationships in this habitat restoration space. The rules surrounding fish and fish habitat can be tricky in Ontario. in that there are a lot of levels of government involved in the decision making. There can be conflicting objectives even in my job. For example, a proponent, a developer may want to offset impacts from a development project by removing a weir that's blocking fish passage, kind of like the culvert that Nick mentioned earlier, which generally we do like to see culverts come out. However, if that barrier is designated as a sea lamprey control barrier, which is another role that DFO carries out, we couldn't permit that as a restoration action. But other restorations, such as selective fish passage, could be considered. So many of our objectives overlap, and establishing relationships with other groups in restoration allows us to realize that those common objectives. The decades of work in aquatic ecosystems that others in the restoration community have is so vital and important that experience and that knowledge gets considered when these proponents need to offset their impact to fish and fish habitat. So by making these connections, establishing these relationships, finding common ground ahead of time, DFO may know that a stewardship group in that same watershed has recently surveyed that area and found that spawning gravel would benefit the fish community present rather than restoring this or removing the sea lamprey barrier. Or we may know that a First Nation further upstream has identified problems with an existing fish ladder. So the proponent could then use restoration of that fish ladder to offset their impacts. I think maybe I'll just leave it there. William, I will get to your question later on in some of my later answers. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for sharing those challenges and how important those connections are as well. So the next person we were hoping could answer is Karen.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Well, being in Canadian government 28 years, I came on some rejuvenation years, and I've gone through 2 downturn cycles. I mean, it seems like the government goes in a bit of a sine wave when it comes to how much it invests in this kind of thing. And despite one of those governments changing the legislation, which is hard to change. So you have, law, the Fisheries Act legislation, you have regulations, and you have policy which support those regulations. And it's relatively easy to change the policy, but it's harder to change the legislation. But one government did, and it was declared that it resulted in lost protections, which would result therefore theoretically in fewer restoration projects happening in terms of the offsetting. But actually, I just wanted to clarify that in my experience going through all of these changes, there was a lot of science and a lot of people within the regulatory component of DFO that still took these new words and ensured that the protections were actually indeed still there in a lot of ways. And so functionally, there still has always been a requirement to ensure that fish and fish habitat is protected. But what I have seen as the problems is that despite these are written into law and written into legislation regardless of the wording, even though now it's come back to restored protections in 2019, what we are actually doing whenever it's audited doesn't always fully protect the fish and fish habitat. We're not achieving what used to be termed no net loss still. And these were made famous by Quigley and Harper in the early 2000s, but also there's some recent work out of Quebec by Kathleen Church that has demonstrated the same thing, that maybe we're building things as we say we would build them, but we're not ensuring they actually result in effective outcomes for fish and fish habitat. And so I do see that as being a problem, but that spans across government. So I'm not sure if the government change is that critical necessarily, because there are a lot of people working in the background behind these things that are really still trying to ensure that those protections are there and that fish and fish habitat isn't lost. But there are things that are, Canada is still going in a bit of a trajectory that we don't want in terms of biodiversity loss. And losses of fish and fish habitat. So what I think, what really is important is that funding does need to to try to be maintained regardless of the partisan politics that are in place, and that commitments that are put in place that outlive current governments, and that we do these regular audits and that we follow up on them in a proper way. And so that's something that I'm working towards in my career as well. But we really want to make sure that what we're doing is working. And I'll leave it at that in the sake of time. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Karen. Okay, our next question is, how can larger scale frameworks, for example, watershed management planning, maybe international approaches or areas of concern, be applied or be relevant to smaller scale systems? So, Nick?
Yeah, so I think watersheds are hierarchical, and the planning frameworks need to be as well. And that the framework that you need for a sub watershed or a large watershed, they both follow the same tenets of sort of the science of international conservation planning. We have some examples of this done in Canada. TRCA's done this work in Toronto. Not everyone has the monitoring and planning resources that the GTA has. The Atlantic Salmon Federation is doing this for their wild salmon watershed program. But really what this framework needs to do is to be able to, it's not just a restoration planning framework. It's much more of a watershed management framework, right? So you need to understand what threats need to be addressed or removed through conservation measures or prevented through protection measures. And that's really a first step into figure out whether the ecosystem will restore itself after that. If it won't, then you would plan restoration activities to address the things that aren't going to heal through habitat forming processes on human timescales. What that needs to do is identify the key habitat components, understand what their current state is, and then decide, quantify, identify what the desired future status is. And that could be a threshold. It could be a limit to further disturbance if that ecosystem component is intact, or it could be a restoration or recovery target if that component is degraded. And then to implement that properly, it would need to be enforceable and it would need to be enforced. And others have talked about this already. This isn't just something that lies with DFO, because oftentimes this requires management of land use in the watershed. And so, achieving that plan is going to require a shared responsibility model across levels of government. To be able to do this, especially at small scales across Canada, which is the scale that needs to happen. And I know the next question deals with that, because there needs to be local decision making about the trade-offs of achieving various targets and thresholds. It needs to be efficient enough and supported so that local communities can engage in this. And so, we're working on achieving that on connectivity planning, which is only one of those dimensions. But we're trying to develop frameworks that are, nationally applicable in terms of protocols, training materials, data management tools, prioritization tools that are efficient, but sort of recognizing as well that there does need to be local scale customization of that. So sort of a balance between standardization and customization. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much for sharing, Nick. Okay, Sarah?
Thanks, Christine. And thanks, Nick, too, because my answer is very much in line with what he said. So Christine, you asked about how these larger scale frameworks, I think you talked about AOCs or areas of concern or international approaches, how we can scale it down for a smaller system. In my mind, what connects these larger scale frameworks is that it's absolutely crucial to connect the framework with the community on the boots on the ground, to use a very common saying, the boots on the ground and their goals, their intended long-term outcomes for the ecosystem. So as Neil mentioned, our team, integrated planning in DFO, is in the midst of collecting information for our fish habitat restoration priorities. So we're focusing to start with on watersheds in lower Great Lakes, the east slopes of the Alberta Rockies, and in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And we received feedback on the goals. Like, we started off with some goals, and we received feedback from the folks that we talked to, encouraging us to use more specific wording. In fact, the phrase SMART goals. So we need to specify outcomes for these species, areas, or ecosystem functions that are specific, measurable, achievable, or actionable, relevant, and time-bound. So what that means for fish habitat restoration is we need to get much more specific about what we're trying to do. We know that we have limited information on the current status of most fish habitat attributes, or what the ecological benefits or consequences of different goals or thresholds might be. So, for example, if we have 60% versus 90%, and what the socioeconomic costs and benefits of achieving those goals. Science can provide insight, and we worked with colleagues on the State of Fish Habitat project. And we did publish, or our colleagues did publish methods for establishing classification schemes and possible thresholds for each of those themes or indicators, or schemes or indicators. But this only informs the setting of the goal. Science can't recommend what the goal or thresholds should be, and that's why we require this social decision-making process. We need to have a good connection within that restoration community. And you don't need a large-scale approach or large-scale funding like the areas of concern to have a good connection to the restoration community. You need to have good governance. And governance in the ecological land and sort of landscape restoration refers to the rules, institutions, and collaborative processes that manage these degraded ecosystems. So this bridges some of the science, the ecology, and then society, making sure that this restoration is biologically feasible, but also that it's equitable. And then, of course, it needs to be economically viable as well. So some of the most successful restorations that we've seen come from these grassroots initiatives with strong governance. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Sarah. The audience is appreciating the conversation. I'm seeing more things going into the chat as well that others can read. I'll pass it over to Neil so he can ask our next couple of questions.
Excellent, thank you. I'm busy looking at questions coming up in the chat here, and this could go on for much longer, but let's moving along. The next question is about how can the Indigenous or local-led approaches be influential for policy development? This following on some of the comments that Christine gave to us, or sorry, Catherine. So I'm going to start with Catherine to answer to that question.
Great, thank you. And also thank you to the other answers. I've been learning a lot following along. This idea, a question around Indigenous or local-led approaches and its connection and forming of policy is really relevant to some of the work that I have the privilege of doing under IPBES, which is a UN platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's through those platforms that Canada and other member states, as well as Indigenous organizations, have all been contributing to informing biodiversity assessments and really thinking about science, evidence for policy and decision making. And I think when we look globally and locally, the solution is like always thinking about place-based, strategic relationships and its alignment into the levers of change. And so I think the things that I think a lot about is that, community engagement-based approaches are really important for so many things. And really just understanding that, it might look like capacity sharing or building in one context. It might be, actually doing science experiments and actually doing things and generating data or sharing data that's been gatekept for, generations. I think the context for each of those watersheds and the communities of people that have had those relationships with water caretaking, farming, all of those things are really important to understand before, we go in and say we have to work with communities. So I always think of some of the guidance is really thinking about knowing our responsibilities individually. So whether we're wearing the hat of a scientist or, a person that lives on that block, we all have homework to do about the privileges and the responsibilities that we have as citizens in a community or people in a watershed in a province or state. And and the world more broadly. And just really understanding that there are instances and times where our collaboration is needed and invited, and really trying to support processes where those invitations come, as opposed to me coming and knocking on a door and saying, like, I never say, like, I'm a scientist, thank me, here's my experiment. It really comes from a place of, like, I just want to understand what are the contexts, what are the, can I, I'll just show up and, and be in community to really understand, because I think whether it's a farmer or, an urban, garden, urban garden, advocate, or an Indigenous community, they know very well what the solutions are and what the barriers and enablers are. And really the question is, like, here are my tools. Which ones do you need now and later? And how can we build that into the sort of policy arrangements or things that we might need to build and strengthen sort of and work towards this shared vision? So I really think for me, I know for sure I'm an immigrant settler scientist. I'm still learning about the Great Lakes, even though I've been here for decades and back and forth, what are the responsibilities and tools and tricks and things that I can bring? But a lot of it is, let's just be in the river together and understand from nature that everything is really connected, whether it's someone working to, implement a wetland or work with, a fisheries issue downriver. These things are not disconnected, and, really trying to uplift these different activities within our watershed is really important, knowing which policy lever it might speak to and which government agency, municipal, or what level of government might have something we can action is really important. And maybe the kinds of tools that we do need to build and strengthen for policy development are things like boundary spanning, and really thinking about how can we connect these different, evidence bases. There's lots of different ways to know a system and solutions, and can we take these local-led approaches and work across scales? So I think finally, the idea about Indigenous and community-led approaches, some of the key things that we really need to be conscious of or responsible for is actually thinking about the work that we all individually need to do. And some of it is really about data sovereignty, like where's that knowledge now? Who does it sit with? And maybe we just need to build trust and transparency with all those who are engaged in policy, and ensure that those who have been marginalized for a long time are at the table. So, spending a lot of time thinking about ethical and equitable participation of Indigenous peoples for their own priorities may align and may not, but doing that work to listen and understand that maybe, what is the bridge we can build together in this direction? What is the capacity that can be strengthened? And there is so much reciprocal benefit and knowledge that can be exchanged if we come to that place. But also for me, working in a university-based institution, it's like, do we have an MOU, and like, do we have information to share? Like, how can we actually create a team so that it's not just degree-based learners, but actually maybe youth who are rooted in their community that want to learn science? And so there's a lot of work and thinking around doing, just what are those ethical considerations in all of the spheres and places we navigate, but moving at the speed of trust, I think, is the most important thing. Knowing sort of the alignments and mismatches, and working to build capacity so that we're all moving right at the same speed will be really important, because all of a sudden these co-benefits and wins emerge when the policy or the funding kind of alignments appear. So those are just some thoughts, but I think really it can be influential. It can be a real point of development. This is a place where Canada can lead, and there are many other countries around the world trying to figure this out. But sharing those stories of both enablers, but also the constraints as being really important for scaling across the country. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Febria. That's a very comprehensive answer. It spoke right to my heart, and everything that you're saying. Speaking about relationships and building trust is, I think what brought many the participants here today. So I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, School of Hard Knocks, right? It's just like, this is all learning by doing. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I can't wait to work together with you or my team and everybody that's here. I'd like to hear from Nick on this question as well, and share his perspective.
Yeah, well, I'm very lucky to be able to work with a number of different Indigenous partners, across the country, and there's themes that emerge, and I've learned a lot from these partners that I work with, a couple of which are on the call, and so I hope I'm reflecting this well. Definitely correct me if not, but what I really see is that there's a real need and a real opportunity for transformative change in the way things are done. Again, across Canada, Indigenous people are looking to reassert their rights and authorities over fish and fish habitat management. But it's not just about their rights. They're also looking to restore their cultural connections and their responsibilities to water, fish, and habitat. The Guardians programs are an example of this. This is really a movement, right? This is Indigenous youth that want to earn their livelihoods and spend their time caring for the land. There's a lot of Indigenous leaders that want to establish restoration economies for their communities. And those communities want to be involved in this at all levels, from doing restoration projects to leading monitoring efforts of fish and fish habitat on their territories, to even establishing co-management frameworks. And, I think that's a real opportunity, and it's things have not worked to date. Proponents find the regulatory process bogged down. We're not, as Karen said, achieving net gain of fish habitat, and I really believe, I'm really optimistic that Indigenous leadership here is a pathway towards that. It's going to require fundamental shifts in how we make regulatory decisions. It's the policy side, how the development projects better incorporate avoidance and mitigation, and especially how they're offset. Part of that is that we just need to eliminate the perverse economic incentives that exist that make some of the development projects profitable only because they're externalizing environmental costs and placing the restoration liabilities on the public. But that's not the majority of them. There's pathways to make these projects work, and expanding offsetting is a really key pathway to do this, not only to address and sort of achieve that net gain, but also to fund that Indigenous-led restoration economy. The funding for doing the monitoring and the stewardship needs to come from somewhere, and this is a pathway to it. So this would involve higher ratios for the current proponent-led projects, but it also involves adding options for pooling mechanisms like fees in lieu and Indigenous-led habitat banking, where those funds can fund the Indigenous stewardship programs. And I'm optimistic because this isn't all bad for business, right? Proponents have never wanted to be responsible for designing, building, and maintaining offsets. That's not their core business model. The current federal focus is on deregulation and increasing the speed of project approvals. And the setting up a co-management framework with Indigenous communities that involves providing ample resources for restoration is really a key pathway to rapidly obtaining consent from those communities to these projects. And really, when you look at the federal landscape, that consent is kind of the one thing that hasn't at least ostensibly been compromised by Bill C5. It's the one kind of remaining check on getting these projects right from a fish habitat perspective. So if we really shift how we do things and put the people who, have been on the land and have managed that habitat sustainably for thousands of years, right at the forefront of continuing to manage it today, I think there's a real opportunity for improvement going forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. There's, I think, a lot of optimism and opportunity here, and hopefully we can build off of that. And there's roles for government, civil society, the proponents, industry, developers, municipal governments, provincial governments. So lots to bring together. And as all of you brought to us today, lots of work together. So I think sounds like there's commitment to doing that. So how do we do that? We've got like 1 minute left. So I don't know if the audience members want to put their questions in the chat. And if we can pick one, sorry, I haven't been checking the question list here very much, but is there something there? Wondering if anyone has been incorporating kind of social science. Oh, there's one that sorry, I'm going to be biased to social science data collection into their work. Has anybody pulled that into restoration? Catherine.
Yeah, I know to be brief, yes, I think there's, sciences are plural and knowledge systems are plural. And I think to just look squarely at the one science that we know really well is really something we need to work on. But social science data can tell us, open the door to storytelling. So we've had storytellers and science communicators, and there's research methodologies that can make that robust and quantitative, as well as things like social network analyses. When we look at what has scaled restoration across watersheds, at national levels. It's been like empowering community groups and organizations to capacity share and strengthen those. And those often become more of a stronger predictor than like the actual number of things that we did in a place. So I think there's a richness of knowledge, and I really thinking like an ecosystem, just when there are matches and mismatches, ecosystem-based approaches, systems-based thinking, all of these things really draw on a multiple disciplines to help us fill those gaps and get us closer towards that shared future. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, ecosystem-based approaches and multidisciplinary. How do we bring everybody, the partners together? Thank you. And the next question, I know we're a little bit, we're at time. So Christine, I think, do you want to see if people want to hang out here and clean up the last question?
If the panelists have time to stay a few extra minutes, is everybody okay with that? Okay, and audience is welcome to please stay if you are able to. So I think we wanted to end on a little bit of a note of optimism. So thinking about the next 5 to 10 years, what are you most optimistic about in this research and policy space? And maybe we'll just ask people to kind of condense down into a bit of hit the high points for what you wanted to share, but we'll go to Sarah first.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, I had to think about this one. What are we optimistic about? What am I optimistic about? It's certainly an interesting time in the aquatic restoration world. From my experience and the restoration priorities initiative that we've been supporting here at DFO, I'd say I'm most inspired by the resilience of these systems that persist despite species at risk populations that persist despite losses of biodiversity, but also the tenacity of the people that are trying to maintain them. A great example is the work done by my colleagues in the Maritimes to designate the Naboosakanuk or St. Mary's River watershed and estuary as our first candidate ecologically significant area under the Fisheries Act. So folks on the call might be familiar with this area. It's targeted for protection because it hosts healthy mainland Atlantic salmon populations, multiple rare species, and some very vulnerable estuarine habitats. This is personally meaningful to me because we contributed to the ESA policy framework for Canada-wide that provides an outline for conservation and protection of these areas in Canada. And then my team here in Ontario and Prairies, we've also developed a national integrated planning framework that provides a vision and framework for fish habitat conservation, protection, and restoration planning using some of the same concepts that we used in our ESA policy. So in a nutshell, trying to keep it brief, I'm optimistic by the tenacious people that are working to conserve fish habitat and the resilience of these systems. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Hey, Catherine.
Thank you. I feel like I've talked too much already, but I feel like the one thing I do want to share is, really pushing against this idea that it's nature over business or, AI. I think the relationships that we build are the things that scale. Investing in those things at the watershed level, it just generates so many other things. I'll put a link to the recent biodiversity and business and biodiversity assessment by this UN platform, IPBES, that shows that it's central, like nature is central to everything that we do. And we really are undercutting ourselves by making it sort of these false dichotomies around we have to do this or we need to plant trees or do something else. I think finding ways to tell our decision makers at all levels that this is what we value and that this is a shared future for all of us as being a really important option we can take. And so there's just so many things that we could all do, but really finding the thing that our science speaks to or the communities that we build in, like advocating for those things are really important, and seeing, these relationships come alongside as being really important so that we can hopefully shift towards policies and matchmaking and funding that allows us to move forward, and it might just be a few trees or one section for this small period, but continuing to move that forward and building capacity alongside is being such a great use of our time. So I'll just put that link in the chat. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Kat, for your motivating words. Karen?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I agree wholeheartedly with what Sarah and Catherine have both said. I'm going to get a little bit more specific in terms of my personal optimism in trying to really improve how offsets are monitored so that we can actually learn from these. So that's been a big soapbox of mine for most of my career, but answering the two key questions: if an individual project was successful, and what are the best habitat improvement actions across projects, so we can really learn at the program scale, increasing ratios for offsets so that we can really try to start to stem this biodiversity loss crisis, and really incorporating Indigenous knowledge indicators into our learning, into our monitoring. Because I think Western science has demonstrated that we are not successful doing it necessarily on our own, and that this community building and learning from each other, learning from what we are doing, and trying to really get the data in a way that together we can do better going forward is giving me optimism, because continuing to do the status quo really isn't working. And so we are bringing out a framework that I want to see operational, that will really see, at least for all the offsetting projects in Canada, being done in a standardized way that we can learn the data from the data. I'll keep it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. I think everyone appreciates hearing about the broader concepts of optimism, but also the specific things that are important to each individual because of where they're sitting. Hey, Nick, you get the last words.
Yeah, I mean, I think I already shared my area of optimism in terms of the potential for emerging Indigenous leadership and co-management in this area. I think the only thing I'd add to it is, as Karen said earlier, the Fisheries Act's been through a couple of major revisions in the past 10 years. Ultimately, on the delivery front, not a lot has changed through that. And that's not a good thing, because though we had a net gain objective, going back to 1986, we've never achieved that, right? I think we've been on a slow net loss path the entire time. And so, it's not just Bill C5 and these national interest projects, but the overall, there are cuts to government, there are, speeding up the regulatory review process. We have to replace that with something that's fundamentally different. And if all we do is gut the number of projects that receive oversight even further, that's not going to cut it. So if we can take the funding that went into, this is also industry funding that went into delays, that went into extended review processes, and we can funnel those resources into restoration, maybe with fewer constraints, maybe with less certainty around it, but we invest more in that, and we trust in delivery partners like local Indigenous people. I'm optimistic that can lead to better outcomes, but we have to, we can't trade off deregulation for environmental harm. We have to replace it with a better way of achieving better environmental outcomes.
Thanks so much, Nick. So I'll end by saying, on behalf of myself, Neil, our partners at CSP, and the webinar communications committees at SCAS, we just want to thank everyone for joining us today. So you can keep an eye on SCAS and CSP social media accounts, their websites, for more potential webinars in the future. And we love to hear about what people want to know more about, or talk more about, or hear from experts of. So please reach out to either of us to share those things. Finally, I want to say, most importantly, thank you to our panelists who offered their valuable perspectives, took a lot of time to share their experiences with us. Thank you for your thoughtful insights and for allowing us to really have an engaging conversation on a topic that's relevant to so many people across different sectors in the aquatic sciences, but even beyond that. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.